I'm on now. Hello. Good morning. Can you all hear me? Awesome. Oh, come on in. You're just in time. I'll give you a minute. Thank you all for coming to the Wisconsin Book Festival. My name is Maggie Ginsberg. I'm a writer, editor, and novelist here in Madison, Wisconsin. Thank you to our featured author this morning, Frank Bures, for making the trip from Minneapolis to talk about his latest book, Pushing the River, an epic battle, a lost history, a near death, and other true canoeing stories. And I'm going to give you a little spoiler, sorry, that near death in the title was his. So stick around if you want to hear about that. Thank you to the wonderful Madison Public Library, celebrating 150 years in service to the community this year. And thank you to the Madison Public Library Foundation and all of the sponsors for helping make this incredible celebration possible. First, a few housekeeping items. Please check your cell phones to make sure they are really on silent so that the author isn't interrupted. If you would like to share your photos, videos, informational posts about this and other Wisconsin Book Festival events, please use hashtag WIBOOKFEST, Wisconsin Book Fest, WI Book Fest, when posting. You probably spotted maybe the wonderful Mystery to Me booksellers posted up just outside the auditorium here. They are selling books by all of the authors that appear on this stage throughout the festival. Please check them out. And that is also where the author signings will take place immediately after this program. So Frank will be out there at the table across from their table. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Frank Bures, who some of you may remember from back when he used to live and write here in this city. I can honestly say that Frank Bures is the reason I started writing professionally back in early 2006. And so I couldn't be more honored or delighted to serve as his conversation partner today. Former Madison writer Frank Bures is the author of the book, The Geography of Madness, Penis Thieves, Voodoo Death, and the Search for Meaning of the World's Strangest Syndromes. Very good. His stories for Madison Magazine won 6 Milwaukee Press Club Awards. Elsewhere, his award-winning work has been included in the Best American Travel Writing, selected as notable in the Best American Essays and Best American Sports Writing. It has also appeared in Harper's, the Washington Post magazine, and countless other places. He can correct me later if he wants, but I don't think it's hyperbole to say that Frank has published thousands of articles in his career. I met Frank through a 2-night continuing studies course he was teaching called Introduction to Freelance Writing, which I had never heard of, and he absolutely changed my life by showing me something I've also come to think of the way the late Mary Oliver articulated in her powerful 3-line poem, Instructions for Living a Life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Frank has always done just that with his keen, spidey sense for what makes a story compelling and deeply human. I have never met anyone more adept at turning his lived experiences into readable prose. Something will happen to Frank on a Friday, and I will read about it in the Star Tribune on Monday. He'll take a seemingly ordinary thing he notices, or a person he meets, or a place he visits, and he'll immediately start researching to put it in historical context, to make sense out of it, out of himself, and out of the rest of us for all of our sakes. That skill set is very much on display in his latest book, Pushing the River, published this year by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. The first sort of half offers a comprehensive, little-told history of this legendary 450-mile, 8 to 10-day Paul Bunyan Canoe Derby, a really formative experience in the first half of the 20th century in Minnesota that brought together indigenous and non-indigenous canoe racers and tens of thousands of spectators. And then true to form, sort of the second half of the book, is a collection of Frank's signature reported articles and essays, features, profiles, as well as his personal adventures and reflections on the powerful role that canoeing has played in his life and the lives of the people he's personally met. We have just under an hour together. Next, I will be turning it over to Frank, who will spend about 15 minutes talking and showing us some slides, talking about the book, and then he's going to sit back down and read one of the more harrowing and ultimately hopeful stories in this book. Then he and I will chat for a bit, and then we will leave about 15 minutes at the end to open it up to your questions, so please be thinking about those. So without further ado, please help me warmly welcome Frank Bures.
Well, thank you, Maggie. I should say Maggie was a good student. She didn't really need a lot of instruction. There was 2 classes, and by the time I was teaching people how to write pitches and then how to sell stories and stuff, and by the time of the 2nd class, I think she had already pitched and sold and written her first story, so she was a natural. That's how I remember it anyway.
It's true, it's true.
Yeah, I'm going to go through some slides of things that are in the books. It's great to be back here in Madison. Is this the Hector DeLuca room or something like that?
Yeah, DeLuca Farm.
I did a story about Hector DeLuca back when I was in Madison, so it's kind of full circle. I'm going to show some slides of things that are in the book, and then I'm going to, like Maggie said, read one piece from the book, and then she and I will talk. So. Pushing the River is essentially a collection of canoeing stories. Like she said, there's one historical piece, and then there's a bunch of other stories. One of them, let's see, is this working? There we go. There's one story about some kayakers who were caught in the Pagami Creek Fire, which was a big fire up in the Boundary Waters and almost didn't make it out. Another of the stories is about our family trip down the Mississippi. We went from Minneapolis to Winona over 5 days on the river, camping on islands and stuff. There's a bunch of stories about the Guinness World Record for paddling down the Mississippi River, which there was 2 records set in 2021 and 2023, and I was reporting on both those, and I was also on the support crew for both those. And this is the support boat for the 2021 attempt, and we didn't really test it before it went into the water, and so it was pretty loaded down. I don't know if you can see this, but when we put it in the water, it had 2 freezers, a microwave, a generator, and there's not a lot of give there. And then this is another photo of it just after the launch. And I was supposed to get on the boat the next day in the morning, and so I went down to Lake City and was waiting for those guys to come because they went overnight. And I hear the sirens go off, and the rescue boat goes screaming across the river. And then a few minutes later, it came back, and then a few minutes after that, these guys came into the port and were like, "Yeah, somebody thought we were sinking." And then we pulled it out and pulled the plugs on the pontoons, and this is what happened. It was drained for I think this goes on for 3 minutes. So it was actually sinking. There's also a piece in there about something you guys probably know all about, the Mendota canoes that were found in Lake Mendota here. It's such a cool story. This woman, who's an underwater archaeologist, was scuba diving and just saw a dugout canoe down in the bottom of the lake, and then dug it out, or they pulled it out, and it turned out to be 1,200 years old. And then the next year she found this one, which was 3,000 years old. And then this is a chart she sent me of all the canoes they found. There's 12 here, going from 800 years old to almost 4,500 years old. And so I wanted to have that in there just because it's really cool, and it also shows how long canoeing has been part of this area. But the biggest piece of the book is this piece about the Paul Bunyan Canoe Derby, which is a historic race from the 1940s and 50s. It went from Bemidji to Minneapolis over 8 to 10 days. And then when it got to Minneapolis, it would kick off this big celebration called the Aquatennial, which some of you may have heard of. And this is some film clip I found in the archives. But they would basically go to stop in each little town along the way and stay overnight and have a big dinner and then go the next day. And it was a huge deal. These little towns would turn out, and everybody and they would have like 2,000 and 3,000 people in these little towns, and they would start them off, on minute intervals. And a cool thing that I found in this race that I didn't know was a lot of those racers were Ojibwe from northern Minnesota, and in the early races, especially, they all made their own canoes, and so it was basically like nobody knew much about this race. Everybody knew that it happened, but they didn't know anything about it. And these are those two guys in the back there are Bud and Harry Tibbetts. They're two Ojibwe guys from northern Minnesota. Ray Tibbetts, also from northern Minnesota. And then if any of you know about canoeing, there's a guy named Gene Jensen who was a legendary canoe racer and designer, and he got his start in this race too. And one of the reasons I was able to write this story with as much detail, is because I found a couple guys who were still alive who had raced in it. One was Harlow Thompson. He won the race in 1951, and he was 99 years old when I interviewed him, and he still remembered everything. And he's since passed away in January this year, so I was able to talk to him. His son said he learned more about the race in that hour than he had in the past 70 years. So, and then Bill Smith. Here's Bill Smith when he was 16 with his dad, and here's Bill Smith at 92, and I was interviewing him, and he remembered so much stuff that had never been reported, and was really cool. And he actually got to be friends with these two guys, Jim and Bernie Smith, who were Ojibwe from northern Minnesota, and he ended up buying their canoe. That's their canoe, and racing in it in 1949 and doing really, really well. And Gene Jensen knew that canoe was special, and so he borrowed it after that, and then came back with a canoe the next year that looked a lot like Jim and Bernie Smith's canoe. And that's Bill's fourth place belt buckle he won enough money to pay for a year at the University of Minnesota in that race. There was a lot of money at stake. But it was a really fun world to get kind of lost in, and to find this history that is there, but nobody has touched for a long time, or nobody remembers. So those are some of the stories in there. The piece I wanted to read is a piece that ran in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and it's about my own kind of close call in cold water, and it's called Dead Cold, and it's in the book. There were actually two pieces that got combined. This is the first one that was in the book. I'll just read this quick, and then Maggie and I'll have some scintillating conversation. The sky was still dark on a Sunday morning in late March of 2021 when I set my new solo canoe on the surface of the Mississippi River. I've been thinking about this moment for years, dreaming of all the places I could paddle once I got this boat. Now I was finally ready to launch on its maiden voyage. I strapped my dry bag onto the crossbar and waded out into the river in my rubber boots, just north of the Ford Parkway Bridge between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I slid the boat out, and when I stepped in it, I noticed it felt a little less steady than other boats I was used to. Then I sat down, started paddling, and forgot about it. Spring had come early. The temperature the week before had been in the 70s. The snow and cold felt like a distant memory, even though a week or so before, ice floes had drifted past here. I knew the water was cold, but it seemed like more of an inconvenience than a threat. Besides, after the first pandemic winter, I was desperate to get outside. The sun was rising. I paddled up the gorge section of the Mississippi, which runs between the high banks of the Twin Cities, with hills, cliffs almost, on either side. To the east, an owl called. To the west, another answered. I was in the middle of the city, but also very far from it. I was a pretty experienced canoeist, but I'd never owned or even paddled a solo canoe. I'd been to the Boundary Waters many times and worked as a trips director for a YMCA camp in northern Minnesota. A few years earlier, my wife and two daughters had paddled down 125 miles of the Mississippi River on a 5-day trip. I was careful. I always stepped on the midline. In all that time, I'd never tipped a canoe. and I had no reason to expect today would be any different. The air temperature was 31 degrees, but it didn't feel that cold. As I made my way upstream, wind started gusting out of the northwest. Though I was protected by the west bank, I moved along, making good time, staying close to shore. When I came to the Lake Street Bridge, I decided to go around a footing in the middle of the river before heading back downstream. As I moved out into the main channel, the wind grew stronger. The canoe was light Kevlar, and as I tried to paddle it, it kept blowing me right. So I reached out for a big sea stroke to correct my course. As I did this, the bow came up, and the wind seemed to catch it from underneath. Before I knew what was happening, the canoe was tipping, slowly at first, then faster. I tried to shift my weight back to the middle, but it was too late. I was past the point of no return. I looked up at the underside of the bridge as I sank sideways into the cold water. Submerged up to my neck, I was shaken, but still calm. "Okay," I said out loud. "Just get to shore." I knew this was dangerous, but I didn't know how dangerous. I'd never heard of cold shock. I didn't know about the mammalian diving reflex where cold water on your face causes blood to move out of your arms and legs to your core. I didn't know that in waters this cold, I only had between 5 and 20 minutes before my body started shutting down. In fact, most of what I knew came from an essay I had read long ago by David Quammen about a troop of Boy Scouts who tipped their canoes in a glacier-filled lake. They'd all died. Quammen thought hypothermia had killed them, but the autopsy concluded they drowned. Quammen tried and failed to answer the riddle of which one had really ended their lives, the cold or the water. Now, years later, I was about to come face to face with the answer. I grabbed my paddle and swam. I held my canoe and kicked for shore. A mile or so downstream was a dam, and I knew if I let my canoe go, it would be destroyed, which at that point was still my greatest fear. But it was already too hard to pull, so I pushed it ahead of me. My boots kept slipping off, and each time I tried to pull them back on, because how, this was a small question in my mind, how could I walk down the rock shore without boots? These are the mistakes we make in our final moments. My body temperature dropped. My right boot slipped off one last time. I let it go, and it was gone. Get to shore, I told myself, trying to focus on the one thing that mattered. Just get to shore. I made some progress. The bank got closer, but it was still at least 50 feet away. It wasn't enough. I kicked harder. I pushed the canoe. After about 10 minutes, I started getting tired. My face dipped under the water. I was a strong swimmer, so this was alarming. And I had a life jacket on, but my armpits hung on the straps while I struggled to keep my head up. My limbs felt heavy. Water came over my chin, into my mouth. Everything felt hard. Then, in a moment of clarity, a thought came into my head. It was not a question. It was not a possibility. And it was not panic. It was just a fact, solid as a stone. I'm not going to make it to that shore. This was around 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning in March on the Mississippi River. I hadn't seen another soul. Suddenly, there was a flash of red in the corner of my eye. It was another canoe coming toward me. Sorry, I always get a little choked up there. In it sat 2 young men. One in the bow had a coiled rope with a float attached. They already knew I was in trouble. He threw the rope. "How long have you been in here?" he asked. "Not long," I said, without really knowing, except that it had been too long. He handed the rope to his friend in the stern, and they paddled toward shore. "Don't worry about your canoe," he said. "We'll get it." I let the boat go. The man in front paddled while the one in back held the rope. I spied a small loop on the back of the boat and pulled myself closer. "I can hold this," I said, and grabbed the loop. Even with the 2 paddlers, it was hard to plow through the current, but eventually we got there. I felt my foot touch the muddy bottom, and I climbed out with 1 boot and 1 sock, then dragged myself onto shore. I turned back to them. "Thanks, you guys. You're a lifesaver." Then I added, "Literally." They turned downstream to retrieve my canoe, which was already far away. On shore, I pulled out my phone out of its small dry bag and called my wife. She could tell something was wrong. "Where are you?" she said. I told her what happened and asked her to come. "Turn the heat on high," I said. Downriver, I could see the men pulling my canoe onto a beach. I knew I needed to get warm, so I started running down the rocky trail, over culverts, through the woods, until I came to the paddlers. I couldn't feel anything in my bootless foot. "We put your canoe up on the beach," the man in front shouted. "Thanks, you guys. I don't really know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." I didn't know what else to say. How do you thank someone for saving your life? "My name's Hunter," the one in back called. "And I'm Jake," said the one in front. I thanked them. They asked if I needed a ride, but I said someone was coming. They waved and paddled back upstream. I ran down the trail, found my canoe, hoisted it onto my shoulders, and ran up the stone stairs to the road, powered by fear and adrenaline. When I got to the top, my wife and 2 daughters pulled up. They opened the back of our minivan. My limbs were stiff, but I climbed in and started peeling off wet clothes. The water temperature, I later learned, was around 42 degrees. My core temperature was probably in the 80s. In the van, my body started shaking. The heat was blasting, but I couldn't feel it at all. Back home, I drew a hot bath and stayed in it for an hour staring at the ceiling. As I laid there, a similar tragedy was unfolding to the south. Just outside Ames, Iowa, a college crew team made up of 2 young men and 3 women were rowing on a small lake when strong winds, the same winds that tipped me, came up and suddenly tipped their boat. The students tried to hold on, but the waves were too violent, so they swam for shore. 2 girls were rescued by locals in kayaks. 1 girl made it most of the way to shore and was pulled out. Both the young men died. To answer David Quammen's question, when you die in cold water, it's not either the hypothermia or the drowning. It's both. Hypothermia paralyzes you, then you drown. For the next 3 days, my fingers hurt. For the next few weeks, it was hard to focus. I kept thinking about those college kids and how lucky I was, about Hunter and Jake. I would wake up at night running through the events, examining the mistakes and miscalculations I hadn't even known I was making. I had nightmares where I was treading water with a distant shore in sight, but knowing I would never make it. I can't think of any reason why those boys died while I lived, but maybe now it can serve some purpose. Maybe you will read this and you will wait. Maybe you will think twice before that post-thaw paddle. Maybe you will see what I did not, that while the cold water beckons every spring, below its surface is a world of pain. Thanks.
Thank you. Every time I read that, and I read that originally when it first happened, I get chills. And I know you said there's a second part. Do you want to say a little bit about how you found those guys again, or where the story ended up? Because I know that even educating people about cold water drowning has become important to you and is an appendix in the back of this book too.
So that story, I didn't know who these guys were. I thought, well, they must just be out on the lake every weekend. And so I would go down there on the weekends and kind of look for this red canoe and see if I could see them, and never did see them. And so it was 1 year about since it happened that the story came out, and within like an hour, I think, of it coming out, I got an email from them because like 4 people had sent them the story because they had told the story too, and they, wondered what happened to me and like thought about it like every day and stuff too, and so then we got together for drinks and eventually went paddling on the river and stuff, and and the book is dedicated to them also.
You went back to the river anyway.
Yes.
Which is kind of a theme in this book. So it's interesting to me that you really don't have to read the stories in order. You don't have to read the history first to sort of get into the stories that come later. But I think because I read it in order and learned about this history, that was just full of terrible things like that. It really helped me read that then with that new sense of fear. So thank you for that. I felt like I really understood how bad this was going to be. And that's, I mean, so canoe culture is a big deal in Minnesota, bigger than I realized. I am not one who canoes. I cannot canoe. I don't know much about it. I've paddled a few times here and there. I've been in kayaks. I've thrown up in a sea kayak. But I guess I always thought of canoeing as a quiet, meditative sort of leisure activity rather than an extreme endurance sport until I read your work. So when did you become aware of it as sort of an extreme endurance sport, and what drew you to that? I know you grew up on the river, but kind of where did this all start for you?
Well, yeah, I grew up in Winona, and in Boy Scouts we went canoeing a lot, and actually Mike Chickanowski, who founded Winona Canoe, was one of the volunteers with our Boy Scout troop and stuff, and so so just growing up in Winona, it was part of that. It was in the water, and we moved back to Minneapolis in 2008 after we left Madison, and we had little kids, and so I'd been doing a lot of traveling before that, and didn't really. When you have little kids, you don't do as much like traveling because it's expensive and takes a long time and stuff. So I started doing more stuff like that, like canoeing and those kind of things, and it was 2018 when I first heard about these guys trying to break the Guinness World Record, and they failed. But then I got in touch with the guy and said, if you try this again, let me know. And so that was probably my real entree into that long distance extreme paddling stuff. I mean, it's always been, people have always done expeditions, and like there's a guy named Bob O'Hare up in Minneapolis who's done all these Arctic expeditions, and he has this Far North Symposium and stuff, and that's a little different from the racing stuff. But the long distance canoe racing has become pretty popular now. There's a big race on the Missouri River called the MR 340 that like 700 or 800 people do every year. There's this Alabama 650. There's like a 1,000-mile race in Florida, and all these things have come up somewhat recently, and so there's this like scene of these races, and now there are some in Minneapolis, and the guy who runs those races wants to bring back a version where you go from the headwaters to Minneapolis again. So we'll see if that happens.
Wow. And I also never thought about it before, just how much goes into it besides paddling. I mean, there's so much involved. And this isn't the first time that you've written about extreme competitive endurance sports, which you also participate in. You run 100 miles trail race, right? And you do these sorts of things. And readers will find out, when they read the book, this is extreme stuff. Like the one Tibbetts guy lost 14 pounds during the race, right? So this is like extreme stuff. Yeah. There was another guy who bandaged his hand back on. I don't even know.
And sometimes they would not train at all. They would just go start the race.
They would just go, especially back then. And of course, we just heard about your harrowing experience, except like I hinted at before, you went back for more, and you brought your kids on these journeys and things. And numerous times in that historical account, you quote people, or the newspaper at the time quoted people as saying, "I'm never doing this again, ever." And then they're absolutely in the race the next year. And so how do you kind of explain that repulsion turned compulsion for these kinds of things?
Well, I mean, that's a usual thing. I mean, you've done some long races too,
Not
right?
100 miles. No,
But,
no way.
well, yeah, you always get done with those things and you're like, I'm never doing that again. And then like 3 days later, you're like, oh, maybe it wasn't so bad. It's just like you're kind of in it for the experience, not like there. I saw a study where they asked, ultra runners, why they do it. And most of them are doing it, just for the experience, because it's interesting. You want to see kind of what happens out there and what you can do, and it's just like it's fun to see what happens, and what you're made of when the chips are down,
Yeah. What have you found on the water that you just, or what have other people found that you've written about, that you just don't find other places or in doing other things?
Well, I don't know. I mean, canoeing is kind of special. I mean, I like all those things, but canoeing is I think especially cool because it's such a long tradition. I mean, people have been canoeing for we don't even know how long. Like the oldest canoe we know of is 10,000 years, and it probably goes way back beyond that. There's they just they're researching some of these. They find on these islands, stone tools that have never been connected to land from like 100,000 years ago, and are trying to figure out how they got there. And one research team just did one of the routes in like dugout canoes, So it's part of this long line of history, and it's just such a, I don't know, you're just like kind of part of the water, and it's just such a perfect technology, I don't know. There's just something nice about it.
Do you want to say anything more about the sort of research that went into this, how you put this together, particularly the history section that sounds like it hasn't really quite been told in this way? It reads like, I know how this works, right? So it reads like streamlined chronological story, but you had to be pulling from all these different, hundreds of articles and your own interviews, and including quite a bit of Indigenous history, like you mentioned. So, can you just start there, and then I've got a second part to the question.
Yeah. Well, particularly for the Paul Bunyan Canoe Derby one, that was mostly newspaper. The Minnesota Historical Society has an archive of all the papers that became what's now the Minnesota Star Tribune, and it's searchable, so you can go in there and search like canoe derby or canoe marathon and what comes up. And so I just went and searched and like downloaded all the articles that had those in it, and it's usually around the time period of the race. And so then you could read through the articles and kind of reconstruct the race. But it was a lot. It was like 700 articles, and you have to read them multiple times because sometimes they're in the race, they're reporting on something at the end that happened in the beginning, and so you have to like figure out the chronology. So there's a lot of work in that way of like hammering out the chronology and then what's relevant and then what makes a good storyline and stuff, because there's very easy to get too many people in there. Mm-hmm. I had just read the book Boys in the Boat, and so that was kind of my model for how it's different because we didn't have the same or I didn't have one character to follow all the way through. It was kind of multiple characters, but I tried to focus on certain characters like for a period of years, so it made it easier to identify with. And obviously some of those characters are the people who are alive, who can tell me their story and stuff. And so it's just a matter of figuring out, how to tell each race so that it feels like a race, and then how to get what to leave. I mean, nonfiction is always a matter of just what to leave out,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it really showed, the way you put it together really showed a lot of legacy in this tradition and in this sport, and a lot of the same names coming up over and over again, and the different generations and things that, connecting those dots is really helpful to see. And I really appreciated the centering of the Indigenous history, the way you did in the historical section. There's a line on page 73 that says, where you're talking about being afraid to come down as far south as Minneapolis. Someone says that, I think they said it in the paper, that Minneapolis was not quote unquote Indian friendly. And so I'm wondering if you can put into context what a big deal it was culturally to have such a popular mainstream event. I mean, 100,000 people at one point coming out to watch these things, to an event like that dominated by Indigenous canoes, particularly before 1950. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know all this stuff because, you only know what's in the paper or what these old guys are telling you. And Bill Smith was the one who told me that, Jim and Bernie Smith didn't want to come down south below like Aiken because it wasn't Indian friendly, and they weren't allowed to stay in some hotels and stuff like that. And there was a lot of racism along those lines. But I was also surprised in reading the coverage that there wasn't more like overt racism. A lot of times it was pretty matter of fact and super collegial, and most of the paddlers all got along, except when somebody was accusing somebody else of cheating. But it seemed like this really nice cultural meeting ground where people were just doing this thing and trying to figure out who's the fastest and who gets the money,
And so much going into it that I would have never thought of, and everybody trying to guess at the shape of a boat, or who's doing it this way, and then they'd all try to do it that way the next time, but that turned out not to be that, and just
right. And all these guys, all these Ojibwe guys were using the forms that they inherited from their parents, and so these canoes have been being made for who knows how long, maybe 3,000 years or something, kind of an unbroken line of history. And so this one particular canoe that Jim and Bernie Smith had, it was just fast, and everybody was experimenting with canoes because they were trying to figure out what's the fastest. And so one year Jensen and Estes came back with a big V-bottom boat, and they won because they were really good paddlers, but they won in spite of the V-bottom, because when you hit the shallow water, it's like you hit a wall, and Jim and Bernie Smith's canoe was more of a round bottom, and so that was the one that they the next year came back with more of a round bottom. And then but everybody else came back with V-bottoms, because they were like, oh, Jensen and Estes use a V-bottom, we're gonna all use V-bottom, and then, but then they got hammered. So
yeah, it was riveting. I was very invested in all of that. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but I'll ask you one more before I open it up. So be thinking of, if you've got some questions, be thinking of those. But I wanted to sort of point out that there is a lot of variety in the stories. After the historical section, there's really a lot of varieties. There's this lovely sort of meditative piece with your family, and the fact that you can get, preteen and teenage kids to go on a 5-day canoe trip all in one was fascinating to me. But that was lovely. There's also this sort of wild, there's a story about the Boundary Water fires that I think is the one that I almost couldn't get through. It was so well written and so terrifying, and I can't believe that they survived that. But there's also this very sort of creepy story about this event that happened between that these two boys experienced as part of a camping trip with a larger group of boys, that they're the only ones who experienced this sort of otherworldly thing, and they both swear by it. And it's still sort of unanswered to this day what happened. And I don't know if you want to talk about that story a little bit, but there's this, you featured this one boy.
Yeah, I had an assignment for the newspaper to write about like a scary outdoor story, and I kept hearing about this place in the Quetico in Canada called Sturgeon Narrows, where a lot of weird stuff happens. And there was this one legendary story that everybody kept telling me about, and so I finally found the guy and tracked him down and got him to tell me the story. And then the kid who he was with, they were 12, and they were like in this tent, and they heard all these noises outside. It was really weird. But I actually found the other guy too. He lives in Milwaukee. He's some like lawyer or something. He was like, yeah, that's pretty much what happened. They hadn't talked since then,
You know who the other guy is?
Yeah.
He's the son of Val Phillips.
Oh, okay.
Who we've just memorialized with a statue on the Capitol Square, the pioneering civil rights leader Val Phillips, who's also the subject of a Wisconsin Historical Society book that just came out, plugging books up here.
Oh, yeah.
It's her
Michael?
son.
Yes,
Michael.
Yeah.
Who experienced this.
Yep. Yeah, you can ask him about it when you see him.
Okay. Yeah, I was just excited to point out that I drew that connection. You heard it here first. That is not in the book.
Yes.
Okay, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Frank? Christy Clancy.
I love at the beginning of your essay when you talk about how you got into your boat and it didn't feel like it was very centered for you. Oh, sorry. When you got into your boat, you mentioned that it didn't feel quite right. You didn't think too much about that, and that's such a great way to like create some drama. But I also wondered, was there something wrong with your boat too? And what's your relationship with your boat now?
We've come to terms. Well, there was actually like because I got it from an outfitter up in the Boundary Waters, and the canoe is usually sold with a seat in the middle, and the seat was set back, and so you can throw your pack in, then it will be balanced. And so it was riding a little bit high, and I just didn't know that was going to be an issue. So I had the seat moved back up to the middle, and now it's fine. So yes, user error a little bit.
Sorry, I forgot to mention there's a microphone coming around. So. Okay.
What was the last year that the Aquatennial race was held? And during its years, were all of the dams, locks and dams on the river in place?
Yeah. The last year it was held was the last year was like a kind of professional race was 1960, and then it went to the Boy Scouts, and they did it for a few years, and then it just petered out. But yeah, all the dams were there. All the dams were there, and so they had to portage around them. I've portaged a lot of those same dams in a race from Brainerd to Minneapolis, and it's not easy. There's one year the two lead guys dropped their canoe down. There's a big embankment at the Blanchard Dam, and they broke everything in their canoe and almost broke their canoe too. So yeah, portaging was part of that race. And what was the second part of your question? Okay, yes. But there was a race in 1919 that started from, it was separate, started from, well, it's kind of connected, but started from Minneapolis and went to Winona, and there were no dams between. At that point, there was one dam in Minneapolis, the Ford Dam, but there was no other dams below that, so you could just go straight through in 1919. So,
Where did the race end? Above St. Anthony Falls?
yeah, it would end above St. Anthony Falls, and everybody would get out, and they would truck the canoes around, and then they would do like a final sprint at the end. And that final sprint was what everybody would turn out for. And there would be, like Maggie said, sometimes 100,000 people out watching because there was nothing else to do. There was no professional sports. There was no nothing, and it was starting this big festival and stuff. And so it was just like a huge event. So yeah, they would do like a mile sprint, and there was cash prize for that too. You could win like $500 or $1,500 for winning the race, and then there's another $50 for which is a lot of money now. So
Yeah, tens of thousands of dollars now, right?
Yeah.
Was at stake all the time in these races.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hey, so I just wanted to ask before we part with you, the people who had the, harrowing experience, the two boys. So come on, what was it that they
You have to
experienced?
read the book.
Gotta read the book. Yes. Well, it's hard to explain. Like they don't even know what it was, but it was like some kind of like they heard like a boom, like a tree falling, and then like another one, and then another one, and another one, and it just got louder and louder and louder and louder. And then they opened the tent, and then there was nothing. And then they closed the tent, and then they heard like voices coming across the water. They thought it sounded like French. And then it sounded like people were coming up onto the land, and then the noise started again, and then so stuff like that. And it was just, and then they ran out of the tent, and there was nothing there, and they don't know what it was. Nobody knows what it was. But there's a few people that have weird stories at that place.
So, do you write fiction too? I missed your intro bio.
No, I don't have that gene.
Somebody.
I have 3. 1, will you do an audiobook?
I would love to. It's a lot of work, though.
Please do one.
Okay.
2, did you go to Leech Lake and actually speak to tribal members?
Well, a lot of those people are not around. I did try to find their descendants. I've talked to one guy's grandkid who's still around. I talked to another guy's grandkid I'm supposed to see hopefully this week up at I'm doing a talk up at Fond du Lake Tribal College, but there's not like a lot of living memory of that stuff because even those kids of those people don't know much about it because that generation didn't like talk about themselves. They didn't like talking about themselves. For a different story, yesterday I interviewed a guy who's 92 who was a hockey player, and before he would say anything, he would say, "I'm not bragging, but they just like they weren't that kind of people." And so I did try to find some people up there, but there's a cemetery, a small cemetery from the Tibbetts family that has a lot of those people in the book in it, and I went there. But as far as living memory, like in the 60s, I talked to one racer who grew up in Pine River who did the Boy Scout race, and he said he grew up with a lot of Native people in his school, and this would have been in the 60s, and their parents would try to get them to go out racing, and they just were not interested. And so I think in that period, a lot of people just like lost interest, and a lot of that stuff was kind of lost.
Because there's definitely canoe races now in different tribal areas.
Yeah, I heard of one up at White Earth, and I know there's some over in what's the one in Wisconsin?
Red River?
Flambeau? No, I can't remember. Anyway, I did talk to somebody who has one up there. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
no, I'd like to know about those.
And the third question, I know a lot of rock climbers, athletes that do things, and when they have near-death experiences, not all of them can go back.
Yeah.
How are you able to go back? Because that's pretty impressive.
Well, I don't know. You have to do like exposure therapy or something because otherwise you'll never do it again. And the first few times I definitely felt like, I don't know if I want to be here, but then you kind of, like it goes away, like especially after a period of years. You don't because at first you always feel it like viscerally, like in your spine, but then the more you kind of do it and it feels that kind of goes away with time.
In the races, what was the material of the canoes from basically the beginning, and was there a transition to the different materials near the end of it?
Yeah, they did. So there was a 1928 race that was a model for the canoe derby, and there was actually a couple people, tribal members, who showed up with birch bark canoes, but the organizers wouldn't let them race because they didn't think they would make it. But otherwise, all the canoes in the beginning were wooden canvas. A lot of Peterborough and stuff like that. So you take a wood frame and put a canvas covering, and then you put the sealant on it so it's waterproof. And they're lighter and faster, but they also rip when you hit rocks and stuff. There was Harlow Thompson, the 99-year-old guy. They had a canoe made by a famous canoe maker named Bill Hafman. There was a wood canoe, all wood, 24 foot. It weighed like 125 pounds, but he said they could paddle it like 16 miles an hour. But by the 1960s, most all the canoes would have been fiberglass, and people were making them themselves. So there was it became more of a canoe building contest than a canoe racing contest.
How did your near-death experience change how you prepare for all canoe trips?
Well, definitely, I bought a dry suit, for cold water, and just always think about that, and just try to be better prepared, and have a good life jacket on that's on tightly, and it just made me a lot more mindful of the things that can go wrong, but definitely I've also bought one of those little fish tank temperature things so you can drop it in the water and see what the temperature is. And so that's probably the main thing. I just don't go out. Or if I would go out, I would either wear a dry suit and stay close to shore and all that sort of stuff. So, you know.
Didn't you also say in the piece that the people who rescued you had just happened to throw the rope in their canoe that day?
Yeah,
and
Hunter's
that's-
a whitewater kayaker, and so he said at the last minute, he was like, we might as well throw this in, you know, just like before they were going. And it was so random that, because they had meant to go on Friday, and something came up and they couldn't go, and then they'd meant to go on Saturday, and they couldn't go, and so then they're like, for some reason, Sunday morning at 7 o'clock was their only window when they could do it. And they probably put in the water upstream about the same time I did downstream, and we like met in the middle.
Has your family given you any grief about going back out? Sorry to put you on the hot seat here, but I know people are wondering.
Well, they make sure I have to leave a note now because I didn't leave a note.
Oh my gosh.
Where I was. That's the main thing.
Oh my gosh. We have time for a couple more. We have about 6 minutes.
I appreciate so much your work and your connections to things like noting that we're part of the water. It seems like your work could be part of Olson or other people who talk about the boundary waters and the connections between generations and place and a love of canoe and this perfect technology. Given that we all have a sense of, or we all are responsible for protecting these places, as a Minnesotan and a knowledgeable person, how does it seem we're doing in protecting the boundary waters, allowing that it's complex mining?
Yeah, there's always that struggle, you know, and there's always the push toward mining, and nobody. I mean, it's just like a constant thing in Minnesota, you know, between people who want to open up for mining and people who don't. People who say it's safe and people who don't. And the Boundary Waters is just such a special place. There's no other place like it in the world. You know, it's one of the darkest skies in the world. There's no other place you can canoe like that except for Canada. But as far as how we're doing, I mean, so far I think good, but these things are always, and there's new pressures with the Trump administration that I'm not totally privy to, but like Friends of the Boundary Waters is really active on, and if you want to know more about that, they're the place to go to find out, you know, what the latest is, because I've done a few things for them, and they're really active on protecting the boundary waters.
Anybody else? Oh,
I'm curious if there's a body of water that's sort of gnawing at you that you really want to explore, and hear what that body of water is, and why you want to visit.
I mean, I've done like parts of the Mississippi from Brainerd basically down to Winona, and I would love to do that upper part from the headwaters, you know, all the way down to the cities. There are also all these small rivers that feed into on our side and on the Wisconsin side, feed into the Mississippi, like the Zumbro and Cannon River, and they're just these really cool places that don't get explored that much, and that's kind of one of my next projects. There is actually, though, I did get roped into being part of the Missouri River record attempt that's happening next summer, and so I'm on the support crew for that, and that'll be from the Missouri River is like a mile longer than the Mississippi, you know, for the whole thing, and so that's next summer. I won't be paddling, but I'll be on the support crew for that, and that's gonna be a lot of work. So there's like a 25-mile portage that we have to do.
the support crew for breaking the Mississippi River is two pieces in the book. It was sort of one piece, and then the way that it ran, I don't know if you want to talk about it, the way that it ran, you took out the pieces that were your firsthand experience and separated them. So there's sort of the third person reported experience, and then there's the second piece that's your behind the scenes experience. And I don't know that it's any better being on the support crew. I mean, that
No,
is
it might
intense.
be worse, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're going like 24 hours a day, or well, theoretically you're on 12 hours and off 12 hours. Usually it's more like you're on 18 or 20 hours and off for like 4 hours or something. And so you're just like, something's always got to happen because the canoe doesn't stop moving, and you got to get them food, you got to get them water and like hydration and stuff. And they always are going at a different speed than you think. And so you got to move the camp, and it's just like, yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're gonna do that again, huh?
Yeah, we're gonna do that again.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
So I have a Kevlar canoe too, and kind of experienced something like what you did. Not the tipping over part, but having the front end go up and then can't control it. What's your feeling right now about Kevlar canoes?
Well, they're nice. They're light,
light.
and they're so easy to handle. But you gotta know how they work and how the weight works. You know, like I mean, even in the canoe derby, they would have to go across Lake Winnibigoshish, and in I think the 1960 race, they had waves that were like 5-6 feet high, and Jensen and Estes put a big 25-pound rock in the back of their canoe, you know, to stabilize it. And so, and for a while, I did the same thing before I was able to move my seat up. I would just put a rock in the front of the canoe and balance it. So yeah, you just gotta kind of be familiar with it and know how it behaves. Don't learn the hard way.
Any last one? I saw one hand go up quickly. No? All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Frank, for this.
All right.
This
Yeah,
was
thanks for
wonderful.
having me.
And a reminder that Frank is now going to be at the signing table out by the Mystery to Me books. So buy all the books and then come see Frank. I'm supposed to usher you there.
You're supposed to